Being diagnosed with cancer is certainly not something anyone actively plans for, and it can often feel like a major loss of control. Despite that loss of control, the cancer experience itself involves making numerous decisions, many of which can depend on where you are in terms of your diagnosis. Now, some of you joining us this evening may have just been diagnosed just a few days ago, or so maybe perhaps you're still trying to wrap your head around everything. Some of you may have already started treatment and have already made some choices about how to move forward in regard to your job. Some may be facing a recurrence and looking for new approaches to balancing work and treatment this time around. Or maybe you're in yet a different place than the ones I've mentioned. Regardless of where exactly you are in your journey, we do hope that you'll leave here today with some new helpful information that's relevant for you and that can help you really determine the path that's going to work best for you moving forward. I also want to acknowledge that while there is guidance throughout for people who are either working or looking for work, we really leaned into the part of our conversation focused on those trying to balance an existing job with a diagnosis. So for those of you on this call who are actively looking for work, I do encourage you to also check out our many job search specific programs and resources, really as an accompaniment to the information that's presented today, so you can feel even more prepared for the process. So listed here are just a few considerations as you begin the process of making decisions around work and cancer. Now, as I mentioned, there are decisions to be made regardless of where you are in your treatment status. So taking a look at what you know to be true so far can be really helpful. The cancer experience is fluid. This is a word you're going to hear me saying a lot this evening. You can make decisions for yourself that work perfectly for you now, but treatment, responses to treatment, side effects, etc., are all subject to change. So keep in mind you may need to evolve your choices to keep up with any of those changes that may be experienced. And finally, get creative when you're coming up with ideas and approaches. Something that may not seem like the perfect fit or may seem like the perfect fit may not turn out to be so. So having a plan B, C, and even D can be really helpful as well. Now, a good place to start before we jump into exploring these various work concerns that often present themselves in a cancer journey, as well as the potential approaches to making decisions around managing them, is by talking about some of the common misconceptions about cancer and work, which we often hear about people encountering and can feel really daunting. Misconceptions that include that people diagnosed with a serious and/or chronic medical condition don't want to work, or people diagnosed with a serious or chronic medical condition can't work, or people balancing work and a medical condition will not be as productive. What's important to remember when thinking about work is that it's often about a lot more than a paycheck and benefits, which of course are really important. But there is an identity piece to it as well that shouldn't be overlooked. Many people take pride in their jobs and employment and get satisfaction from working regardless of the industry or role, because understandably, work is a big part of who they are. So this idea that cancer takes away the ability or the desire to work is often false. We list these here to highlight these range of misconceptions around cancer as it relates to work. And we'll be discussing some of the strategies and the tools to help you understand how to approach your situation in order to make informed decisions about whether, if, or how to work during all or part of treatment. These are all personal decisions and it can vary from situation to situation. So really just understanding the full perspective of it can be really helpful. So from here, we jump into the heart of this work and cancer conversation, and that is of the diagnosis and work dilemma. So for many people, the question of how work factors in or whether it factors in at all becomes really important. And it can be quite challenging to look at the big picture when you're also focused on addressing a health crisis. All of these unknowns can feel understandably really overwhelming. So it's important in these moments to acknowledge the reality of what's going on, and then from there, start to isolate and answer some specific questions in order to really illuminate that best path forward for you. Now, when thinking through approaching decision-making around balancing work and cancer, what are the questions that you should consider asking yourself to get you in that right direction? A good place to start is by spending some time considering what your wants are versus just what your needs are. These tend to vary from person to person. And when people start to list out their wants and needs, they might sometimes find that they're not really in alignment with one another, and that's okay. The idea here is to take a step back and start evaluating the individual parts within the bigger picture to really find out what's true for you specifically. So for example, what are your financial and insurance needs? Now, for some people, these are going to be the driving decisions about whether or not to work during treatment. But for others, that's not really the case. So also asking yourself, how is your identity connected to your job? As I mentioned, that can be an aspect of it. Maybe you love what you do and want to make sure that you're able to continue doing it because it's going to help you cope during treatment. Again, this isn't going to be the case for everyone, but the point is to really have a sense of how these things come into play for you. And of course, no person is only their job and diagnosis. So what might you want to consider in terms of your personal life? Do you have obligations to family or other loved ones that need to be prioritized? What do you think you might need in terms of self-care? You may also find that once you start asking yourself these questions, more questions start to crop up that you don't know how to answer by yourself, and that's okay. It's also completely understandable if this part of the process starts to feel really overwhelming. Now, when approaching decisions around work after a diagnosis, a lot of emotions can crop up. The big picture can feel overwhelming. Regardless of what's going on with you emotionally, it is important for you to know that your feelings are valid and there's no quote unquote right reaction. Allowing yourself to feel those emotions can be a really important part of preparing yourself to make decisions. So first things first, taking a beat can be helpful to get yourself centered and focused. Look at what you need to do next. Give yourself the space to breathe and process. Start to view the process as smaller parts making up the whole. Each small decision can add up to one overarching decision about work, and this can make those next steps feel a little bit more manageable. So over the next few slides in this evening, we're going to discuss what it looks like to gather information, get organized to better understand what your options are, identify and evaluate the options that are available to you, make potential action plans for moving forward with treatments, surgeries, medical interventions, and then how work might fit in with these factors. Monitor and evaluate how this plan could work, weigh out existing options, and finally, operate with the idea that everything is fluid and things may change. So you may need to adjust your plan by reevaluating and revisiting the previous steps over again. I do want to quickly acknowledge, however, that sometimes decisions do need to be made rather quickly due to specific circumstances. So it may not always be possible to apply this exact process to every single decision you make. And that's okay too. What we're trying to do here is to offer you some tips and tools that maybe will help with making decisions and make that planning just a little bit easier. Excuse me. Now, as mentioned, an important step in decision-making is gathering information that can help guide you in the process. It's important to ensure that when you're making decisions about the balancing act between work and your diagnosis, you have both accurate and enough information to make those informed choices. Being intentional and mindful of the information you want to have on hand can sometimes naturally highlight which path will work best for you when you do weigh all of the involved factors. As will be a notable theme throughout tonight, and I've said a lot of times already, and you're going to hear it a lot more, the cancer experience can often be fluid. Things may change rather quickly. So having a full understanding of the scope of your unique circumstance can really help to ensure that you're ready to pivot and change your plan and approach if that does become necessary. So to simplify this process a bit, we have broken down the types of information to gather into 3 categories, which you can see laid out on this slide: medical and treatment information, work information, and legal information. So over these next few slides, we'll take a deeper dive into each to really understand what specifically falls into each of these 3 categories and why they're important. So the best and most logical place to start when it comes to gathering medical and treatment information is your medical team. So ask questions about the timeline for surgery and any other treatment protocols like chemo or radiation, as well as what potential side effects you might need to expect. Understanding this information can help you to start figure out whether or not it will be possible for you to work during all or part of treatment. It's also important for you to be open with your healthcare team about the specifics of what your job entails day to day, so including any concerns you might have already, as well as your work-related goals, so they can help work with you on a plan for balancing work and cancer that works for what you want as well. So for example, taking a proactive approach to making sure that your chemo treatments are scheduled in a way that lines up with your needs and commitments at work can help you to feel like a much more active participant in your care while also feeling in more control of your work responsibilities. So an example of this might look like your doctor says they would like to see you in 2 weeks, and the scheduler says that you can come in on a Thursday morning, but you know that you have a set meeting with your team every Thursday morning that's really important for you to participate in. It's worth asking if Wednesday or Friday would work instead. While this may not always be possible, remember that asking can't hurt, and it can also relieve you of some of that internal pressure and stress you might be feeling. Again, it might not work with the doctor's schedule, it might not work with the hospital schedule, but again, asking never hurts. So now we move into our conversation about gathering information regarding work itself. Now, this part of the process can help you to start to think about how you can manage your treatment protocol with the way that your company works and the duties of your job. So for instance, researching your workplace's existing policies and flexibilities can lend insight into how to devise a plan should you decide to continue working during all or part of treatment. And learning about your company's leave policies can also help you to determine your ability to take time off in either larger or smaller chunks in the event that you need to do that. So much of the information you're looking for is usually accessible through an online employee portal or in the handbook that you were given when you were first hired. And you can pretty much lead through these on your own without having to speak with anybody. But with that said, you may also prefer to have a conversation with a person, or may find that you need to reach out to someone in order to get your hands on a copy of that employee handbook or have some of those questions of yours answered. Also, if you've been at the company for a while and have potentially seen coworkers experiencing personal challenges, think back to how they were handled, both the good and the bad aspects, and consider how that might color your situation and experience and perhaps approach. And if you have a close enough relationship to them, perhaps consider talking to them about how the company responded to them. And this doesn't necessarily have to be someone that has gone through a cancer experience or a major illness. Perhaps it was someone that had to take time off to care for a sick family member, or someone who even had to take time off for maternity leave. You know, really evaluating and analyzing what the response of the company was and coworkers as well can be helpful in giving you a sense of how you might want to approach your situation and prepare for it. Excuse me. So as we discuss the process of gathering legal information, I want to remind you all that, as you can see on my background, I am a licensed social worker. I am not an attorney, so the law is not my area of training or licensure. So if you do have specific questions about your situation, I absolutely encourage you to reach out to an attorney or legal organization, of which we do provide a list of a number of them at the end of this presentation and on the slides that you all have available to you. But the law does play a very important role in thinking about and talking about work and cancer, which is why we include it. Now, understandably, it can be kind of scary to start thinking about the law and our jobs. So I do want to stress that we don't talk about this topic because we think it's likely that an employment situation will become litigious, but rather because legal and practical issues do not exist in separate vacuums. Often when there is a practical concern, there is a legal piece to it as well. And so for many people, the law becomes a key tool for helping them pull together a plan for working through treatment if they qualify for protections. So again, if you're interested in learning more about which federal or state workplace laws and protections may or may not be available to you, I wholeheartedly encourage you to reach out to a legal expert. And you can find some more broad, reliable information about laws on various government websites, as well as educational blogs and resources. And again, you'll see those at the end of the presentation as well. And we also have a few resources listed on our website through the link at the bottom of this slide. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I do want to discuss one key law in order to help provide a foundation for any additional fact-finding that may be necessary. So this law is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So to start, the ADA is a federal law. So this means that it applies in all 50 states. The part that's relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I. And like all laws, it has certain requirements that must be met in order to use it. So the first is that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. And second, you must have the necessary skills, certifications, experience to do the job. And finally, your disability must meet the criteria as it's determined by the ADA. So if you do meet all of these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and may also provide access to reasonable accommodations, which is something I'm going to touch on later. Again, this is really just a quick overview so that you know the ADA is something to consider. And again, I encourage you to speak with a legal professional to determine if you're eligible to use the ADA's protections, because this can really impact how and which approaches you decide to take when balancing your diagnosis and work. And I also do want to point out, as you can see in the circle on the slide, there are state fair employment laws that can tend to provide even further protections beyond that of the ADA. And also some of the requirements for the ADA may be a little bit more lenient in state fair employment law, just such as the number of employees that are needed in order for the law to apply to that company. Excuse me. So once you've gathered all your information, getting and staying organized is the next step. So in general, being organized makes life easier and removes some of the chaos that we all naturally face in our lives. But after receiving a cancer diagnosis, staying organized can be extremely helpful and may even have a positive impact, both physically and emotionally. Because staying organized can aid in the various decisions that you may need to make, including the decision of whether or not to work. It can help you feel a sense of control during some of those more overwhelming moments. It can help decrease work-related stress, and it can allow you to be better prepared for any potential hiccups or issues that could arise along the way, which could lead to making new decisions. So to really do this, I want to break down some best practices for getting and staying organized. So keeping all of your paperwork and documents in one place may seem like a simple thing, but it can make a really big difference. Whether you're a fan of digital files or you prefer to print out hard copies that you can actually touch and highlight, just having a centralized storage spot can reduce the headache of constantly searching for important details necessary to make your appointments, communicate with your insurance company, and so on. It's also the case that during your initial information gathering, you might come across some pieces of information that weren't totally relevant to you at the time, but may be useful down the line. Having all of your information stored in the same place means that you'll know where to look for it when the time comes. Another good practice is to take notes during your appointments. So making audio recordings may also be a good or even better option if the person you're speaking with agrees to it. But really, notes and recordings can remove the pressure to rely heavily on your memory, which might be under a lot of pressure given all of the emotions and information that you're dealing with. Our Living and Working with Cancer workbook that can be downloaded off of our website or ordered in a hard copy has a notes section in it that can also help you to keep track of things. If you feel comfortable, bring a friend or family member to appointments. You may rather attend appointments and treatment alone, and that's entirely a personal decision. But if you are open to having someone from your support network join you, they can often act as another recording device and perhaps catch some things that you may have missed or forgotten in your conversations with your doctor, since so much information is coming at you at once. Also, having someone to keep you company can help to keep your spirits up and distract you from some of the stress and pressure you might be feeling. Now, a notebook to write everything down so you have a record to refer back to is really useful as well. It can be helpful to write down ideas and scripts for future workplace conversations, such as phone calls or project updates. It's also a place to keep track of those involved in your care or employment conversations, and a place to jot down any tips that are given to you from others in the cancer community, of which I know a lot of people in the cancer community really love to share what's worked for them and what hasn't. It can also be helpful to keep track of questions that might arise outside of appointment times or concerns regarding treatment or side effects or certain observations that you've made during or after treatment. Again, this can allow for a more involved process where you're able to be an active participant in your treatment plan by really reporting what you're experiencing. Overall, taking the time to prepare and get organized on the days when you have more energy can really pay off on the days that you have less. So these are really just tools that can be used so you don't have to rely solely on your memory, which is definitely impacted by just the news of a diagnosis, let alone whatever your treatment protocol might be. Now, the next step before actually making your decisions and a potential commitment to a plan is to take a fine-tooth comb to the options available and really assess and evaluate the feasibility of them, creating a successful and effective path forward for you. Really look at each aspect of your action plan and try to play devil's advocate where necessary. Get input from others if that's helpful, to really try and sense any challenges that may arise given your specific situation and what you know about your specific job, company, and personal needs. It's critical to be able to figure out the benefits for each option and weigh and prioritize them. Equally important to the benefits is understanding what the challenges to these options might be. And once you've identified what potential challenges could conflict with the plan that you've come up with, revisit the information you gathered and organized to try and identify if there are any other options that might work better for you. Regardless of what you ultimately land on as your best choice, make sure that you record your thought process when weighing your options. So in the event that you do need to reassess, you have your original thinking mapped out to help you understand alternative paths and the thinking there. A really critical reminder is that an ongoing piece of the puzzle when making decisions is being sure to continue to reassess and reevaluate those decisions to ensure that they're still in line with your wants and needs, as well as what's realistic for you. Decision-making is not static, and so it often requires, evolving one's plans as the situations may progress and evolve. So now that you've put in the work of gathering information, getting yourself organized, and identifying and evaluating the options at hand, it's time to actually focus on making a decision about whether to work and what that all is going to look like for you. To do this, review the information you've collected and think through how it might be applied in different scenarios. Talk through some of the pros and cons of your options with those close to you who understand your circumstance, as they can often provide some different perspectives, which can highlight aspects that you yourself may not have considered. Also remember that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation where you're either working through all of treatment or not working at all. For plenty of survivors, strategically taking shorter periods of time off, whether that means 2 weeks to recover from surgery or a few days here and there for chemo appointments, is what allows them to continue to stay actively engaged in their work. I also want to mention that if you're looking for work when you receive a diagnosis, you can also think about what it would look like to get a job during this stage and what your considerations would need to be in order to make a decision around working or not. It can be hard to really weigh the practical options out when you're not totally sure what your situation can be, but again, using the information that you know to be true at the time can be really helpful. Excuse me, sorry. So let's talk about creating an actual plan for yourself. Now, as I've mentioned throughout, after receiving a cancer diagnosis and really throughout treatment, people can feel like a lot of things are suddenly just completely out of their control. But creating an action plan to the extent that it is possible can help you to feel empowered and maybe even regain a sense of control over some of your circumstances. So here I've laid out the elements of a successful action plan. First, it addresses your unique needs and goals in terms of treatment, work, your personal and family life, and so on. It's also key that there's some sense of priority that's given to the various items on your action plan. But it's also important to remember that the treatment experience is, as I've mentioned, fluid. It's possible things may change, and while the plan that you outlined today may seem airtight, it may have to be modified over time as things really evolve. So it's important to stay flexible and communicate appropriately at work. Additionally, when we think about a successful action plan in the context of work, it also incorporates your employer's needs as well as your own. This is not to say that your employer's needs should ever be placed or put above yours, or that there's no room to negotiate on how work's going to get done. Again, we're going to talk about that more shortly, but it's important to make sure that these do get woven into your thinking as well. Another critical component of an action plan is identifying the places where others may be able to pitch in. Now, for some, understandably, asking for help can be a real challenge. But when and where you feel comfortable to do so, asking for help can really alleviate some of the stress and worries that may be weighing you down. In a work context, that may mean sitting down with your manager or supervisor so you can think through together how coworkers might be able to help. Finally, as we've discussed, there's a benefit to having things written down, and the same is certainly true here. A practice we often encourage is keeping a work diary, which can be a useful tool in helping you to evolve your action plan based on your needs. So I want to just discuss quickly how a work and cancer diary can really work for you. It can help you to map out an overview of what treatment's likely to look like in both the short and longer term. So write down key treatment dates. So for example, surgery or chemo, and compare those against some of your known work deadlines and events to really see where there might be any issues or conflicts in terms of scheduling. Now, don't be afraid to ask your healthcare team if a treatment can be rescheduled to a different day if that works better for you. Remember, how treatment plays out may change over time, so you may need to revise. And of course, there may be certain appointments and treatments that are date specific, so they need to take priority over work. But as we discussed earlier, it's worth talking to your healthcare team to see where there is that flexibility. Your schedule is an area where there's opportunity for you to become an active participant in your care by advocating for your needs and ultimately feeling more in control of the process. Now, once you've started to lay out the broad overview of treatment as a whole, you can start to really drill down into mapping out what each individual work week might look like. And then keep notes on your experiences of how the week's actually playing out as they're going along. Tracking how you feel at certain times of the day, what side effects you're experiencing, if and how you're able to identify any ways to mitigate symptoms can really help reveal those important patterns, which you can then work with strategically. So if your schedule is flexible, aiming to maximize your peak performance hours. Keep careful notes about the way you feel throughout each day/week, and this can reveal important patterns with side effects, energy levels, etc. And once you have this reliable log, you can also use it to begin brainstorming job modifications that could address your needs. And in cases where you want to formally request reasonable accommodations, you can use these notes to plan out and drive conversations with your employer. If you're in active treatment, many people also find them useful tools in thinking through optimal times for treatments. Look back over your notes about prior treatments to identify those patterns that you notice, and then use that information to schedule your appointments to times that are more conducive to your work schedule and really your energy levels. Excuse me. Your work diary can also help you determine when it makes sense to schedule your doctor appointments. For example, if you feel exhausted 3 or 4 hours after treatment, consider scheduling a 2 p.m. appointment so you'll be off of work when that fatigue really hits, or scheduling sessions for Friday afternoons if you know that your body's going to need a few days to recover. A detailed written record of your day-to-day activities at work can also prove beneficial on a number of levels. And this can include a description of your projects, associated tasks, and what's been done, as well as a to-do list with next steps. Keeping notes in this way can really help you stay organized and effectively manage your time as you move throughout your day. But it also creates a log of the tasks that you've accomplished the day or week or month, which can be very helpful if and when chemo brain or fatigue starts to really impact your memory and your ability to focus. Additionally, tracking hours and assignments could prove valuable if a worst case scenario arises at work and you start to suspect that perhaps there may be some discrimination taking place. So to-do lists can help you stay organized and effectively manage your time, help you to remember what you did the day or week or month before, and tracking hours and assignments can really help you. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we don't like to bring this up that you think there will be an issue at work, but unfortunately, we do know that some people do run into problems in their workplaces. And in those instances, having this notebook where you've been keeping your detailed account of your time and accomplishments can prove very valuable if you're being accused otherwise. And finally, as this last bullet point suggests, your work and cancer diary can be a really good place for you to draft and revise a disclosure plan, which we'll discuss. Now, I want to move on to this idea of modifications at work, which takes us back to the ADA. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the potential benefits that's available through the ADA for those who qualify is access to reasonable accommodations. So reasonable accommodations are modifications to your job, your schedule, or the environment that you work in that makes it possible for you to perform the essential duties of your job. So on this slide, you'll see a few resources that delve a little deeper into reasonable accommodations and how to request them. And for now, we'll just talk a little bit more about how to really identify what those potential accommodations might be. So there's a number of questions that you can ask yourself to help identify what those potential accommodations are. So some of the examples on here include, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would mean ultimately that you are working the same number of hours, they're just distributed differently. So varying the start and end times of the workday to really maximize the hours that you're feeling the best can be a huge help. And this is something that you could have tracked in your work and cancer diary. So maybe turning your 9 to 5 day into a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day, or taking time out during the workday to go to appointments and making the time up by working later that day or later that week. Again, this may not work for every kind of job, but it could be a great solution for people who do project-based work. And it's not as much about the specific hours that you're working, just that you're getting the job done. Another idea could be working from home part-time or full-time. So similar to changing working hours, this may not work for every type of job, in particular those who may need to be customer facing. But it is becoming more and more commonplace. So it's possible that there's already a policy about this in your employee handbook. And if not, perhaps one could be created. Among other things, this can eliminate a draining commute and reserve energy to work. Another idea is if your job includes allocated break times, is it possible for you to take more or more frequent breaks? Maybe for you, it's about getting access to special equipment. Speak to type software if you're experiencing neuropathy in your hands, or an anti-glare screen or blue light glasses if looking at the computer screen is giving you a headache or causing further fatigue. Another possibility might be to have certain non-essential tasks or projects removed from your job. Again, these are all just examples that are meant to help you start thinking about accommodations and also to remove some of the myths around the concept that they're expensive or unlikely to be approved. The fact is that according to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost an employer $500 or less, and many cost nothing. So be resourceful. Really think about your environment and what might be causing those specific challenges that you're experiencing. Again, remember, it's all fluid. What might work and what might make work easier today might be different tomorrow. This isn't a one-time only opportunity, and you are entitled to ask for more than one accommodation if necessary. And I also just want to encourage people to check out the Job Accommodation Network, which is askjan.org. Again, it will be listed at the end of the presentation, but they are really helpful in terms of being creative, thinking through what your side effects are and what some potential accommodations might help with. So as I mentioned earlier, the work diary was a good place to start considering disclosure, which is often a major area of concern for many who are working with a diagnosis. So whether or not to disclose at work or in other areas of your life is an incredibly personal decision. And it's one that requires a lot of thought. We share this slide often. I'm sure if you've been to other presentations of ours, you've seen it before, but it's really because it's such a nuanced decision for so many. What's important to know and remember is that you are not required or obligated to share your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. Now, a lot of individuals with cancer often confuse omitting with lying, but it's personal information and it's not necessary to share any or all personal information with your employer. It can really often come down to how you feel about sharing. So additional considerations include why you want to share. Is it because you feel you want to? Or is it because it's necessary in order to access certain protections or benefits? There's really no right answer. It's about what your specific needs and preferences are. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. So when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say, you can always say more later, but you can never say less. If there's a need for you to divulge information down the road, you can be prepared to do so. And I think that's a good idea to be prepared to do so, but just know that you don't have to offer it up right away. Seeing disclosure on this spectrum can really help you to make the decision of what, how much, and to whom you'll be sharing that information. And finally, what do you know so far? When you're considering disclosure, it's important to share what you know to be true and not necessarily all of the many what ifs. Getting accurate information from your healthcare provider on timelines and treatment protocols can be helpful, but you don't necessarily want to tell your employer that things are definitive because circumstances can change. If you do decide to disclose, let them know that you're telling them what you know to be true now, and this can change. And if it does, you will communicate that to them. Assuring your employer that the dialogue will be open can often help ease some of their concerns around being kept in the loop and being most prepared to handle the situation. Now, disclosure on the online space can have ramifications in the workplace as well. So we do recommend developing a personal disclosure plan for your online presence also. So this includes making clear decisions about what, if any, information about your cancer journey you're going to share online and off, and where you're going to share it in terms of specific websites or blogs. And as you're thinking through what's going to work best for you, it's also a good idea to spend some time considering the potential long-term impact of online disclosures. Some of you may have disclosed at work and everyone's being really supportive, which is an outstanding situation to be in. But the fact is that the internet doesn't go away. So it's important to think beyond right now and consider some possible long-term impacts. None of us can predict the future. So you might find yourself unexpectedly looking for a job 5 years from now, or your supportive boss may have moved on and has been replaced by someone who decides to start Googling their new staff. And frankly, there's no way to know how that person is going to respond to whatever information they might find online. Now, the next step after you've made those decisions is to communicate those decisions with the people in your network, whether they're friends and family or people you've connected with online. Unfortunately, there's so many stories from people who experience accidental disclosure from a loved one online. And of course, even if you shared your preferences with your loved ones, it's still a good idea to monitor what others are posting so you have a sense of what's out there about you. Finally, it can be a good idea to consider your relationship to the larger cancer community. For example, if you volunteer with a cancer-related organization, there may be questions about the affiliation. So it can just be helpful to kind of give careful thought to the language that you use when you're referencing your involvement, if you are choosing not to share your own diagnosis with your coworkers. Now, when it comes to disclosing at work, like the rest of the decisions around sharing the news, it's an incredibly personal one, and it does require a lot of thought. So it's typically not an all or nothing scenario. As I did mention before, you're not required to provide information about your health or your health history to your employer, current or prospective, nor can they ask. But there can be situations where you might have to share information in order to access your rights under the law. And this doesn't mean that you're sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis. It just means you might have to provide some support for why you are eligible to be asking for whatever it is that you might be asking for. So for example, it would be pretty difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they technically had no idea you had a condition to discriminate against. So as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it is important to consider all of those angles. There's a ton of resources on disclosure at the bottom of this slide as well. Now, when deciding whether or not to share information about your cancer status at work, there are two major things to consider overall. One is, how will your treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And then what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? As with any personal decisions, there are different reasons that people choose to disclose. Some people are sharers. They can't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling. But others feel very uncomfortable sharing personal information and are much more private. Now, however you feel about sharing is totally valid and should be taken into account. The individual culture of the workplace may also play a role. Thinking about the various ways people communicate with each other at work can help you decide if, how, and how much you want to share that information at work. As I mentioned earlier, you may want to think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar, and really just think through their experiences in terms of how you might want to approach your own. Now, when contemplating who to tell, that's really going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. And it's possible you might have to have more than one disclosure conversation. So we do encourage people to start with the person that is going to be easiest to talk to, which for many is a direct supervisor, mostly because this is someone that you're going to have an ongoing conversation with, and potentially someone who could be an advocate for you with the higher ups. But it's also important to bear in mind that most managers have not been trained to be managers. So this may be the first time that they're having this type of conversation and could really feel in uncharted territory themselves. Unfortunately, this can often put the burden on the employee with cancer to help teach the manager what to do next. So we do have available a manager's toolkit that we created because a lot of survivors asked us for something that was concrete that they could take with them into these conversations with their employers to really outline what would make them feel helped and supported. And so it's a tool that can be really useful. So for other people, a supervisor is out of the question, so they might need to go to HR instead. HR can be a font of information because they're really the ones who understand the employee handbook that we talked about and who may have actually dealt with similar experiences with previous employees. But really the most important thing to disclose in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is fluid, as we've discussed, and really helping them understand that the things you're sharing today are what you know today, but they may not apply next week or next month. So this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation that you intend to keep them communicated with upon. So they will stay updated throughout the process. Now, part of the disclosure decision, including figuring out how much to share and with whom, can involve considering what you know about the possible side effects that you're likely to experience, especially if you're choosing not to disclose either at all or widely within your organization. And this is really because the changes bodies can go through during treatment, whether they're visible side effects like hair loss or skin changes, or invisible side effects such as cognitive changes or a major decrease in overall energy levels, can unfortunately disclose a lot of information, even if your words don't. So if you're someone who isn't planning to disclose or someone who has chosen not to disclose widely, it can be a good idea to have a sense of the types of changes you're likely to experience and whether those might be perceived by your coworkers in a way that could potentially invite questions. And then from there, it's about knowing how to have prepared responses to any questions that might arise so that you don't accidentally share any information that you would have preferred to keep private. For those of you who are currently working remotely, you'll still want to be mindful about your choices regarding disclosure and privacy. So be careful not to develop like a false sense of security just because you're working in a more personal, private space. In some ways, you actually may need to be even more hyper aware. Every organization handles its cyber security and tracking of employee activity differently. And even if you think you have a good idea of your company culture, you may not know the full extent of your organization's oversight. So on the extreme end of the spectrum, some companies routinely use programs that record keystrokes and take screenshots of your computer desktop, not to mention tracking different websites and programs. A company's goal typically is not for these to be malicious, but it's just to focus on helping to measure and support productivity of their employees. But it's still important to be aware that working in a digital space does provide more opportunity for a breach of your privacy. So when it comes to your decisions around disclosure, keep the following in mind. You know, when you're on camera, if you work from home and need to participate in a video meeting, remember coworkers, clients, and others will be able to view your personal space. If you decided not to disclose your cancer diagnosis, just make sure that there isn't anything in the background that shows more than you're comfortable sharing. As you can see, I have a background on my Zoom today, and there's a lot of options on Zoom that are either backgrounds you can put up or things that will blur your background. Then there's meeting recordings. Many offices share login information for the company's video conferencing platform. So to safeguard any personal information, you may want to switch to your own account before having a private telehealth appointment. And even then, check that the program's not set to auto record. There's screen sharing. So if you need to share your screen during a meeting, be aware of any personal information you may have on your computer. Desktop files, pop-up notifications for incoming emails, and even internet browser bookmarks or tabs could be seen by others. There's chat applications that a lot of companies use for their employees to communicate. But just note that because your employer owns that program, there's always a chance that even your private messages to a coworker that you trust could be reviewed by a supervisor or HR. Personal accounts, files, and passwords. Be careful not to leave personal accounts open on your work computer. If you do open a personal account like your email on a work device, we do recommend that you sign out at the end of the day and set up maybe a two-factor authentication so that they can't access it. And then finally, internet use and activity. Obviously, companies have different ways of monitoring employees' activity and productivity. So it's very easy for your company's network administrator to monitor your internet activity, even if you are browsing in perhaps private incognito mode. So just think twice before, doing research on your diagnosis or treatments or side effects. And really the point here with all of this is to think ahead of time before you engage in certain work-related or personal activities online and make informed decisions about those. This way, any disclosure related to your diagnosis will be a result of a decision that you made, and you can instead focus on the important aspects of your job. And just some additional considerations to avoid accidental disclosure, both when we're working remotely or in the office. Think carefully before talking about your diagnosis or medical information in any kind of shared spaces. If you're working on site and there's a break room or shared kitchen space, look around to see who's around in case you need to take a phone call from your doctor or have a conversation that you believe is private with a coworker. You also want to think about if you're having a conversation with a colleague that you trust and you're perhaps the first people to arrive in a virtual meeting, check that the auto record feature isn't on and you're not being taped. Or even if you're not, perhaps avoid using that spot to talk in case someone else arrives and accidentally overhears or catches you in a visibly emotional moment and has questions. Be mindful if you start leaving early or arriving late frequently, or if you know you're going to be taking an extended period of time off. Casual conversations with coworkers can be a situation that's ripe for accidental disclosure if you've decided not to share your diagnosis. Often well-meaning colleagues who may have seen you leaving early a lot or seen a lot of calendar blocks on your calendar may inquire how you're doing. So this is another instance where you want to devote some time and energy to preparing for possible conversations and scenarios so that you can help prevent yourself from accidentally sharing more information than you want or intend to. Practicing how to redirect conversations using a method we call the SWIVEL can be really helpful, ultimately pivoting the conversation to a place you feel more comfortable by having alternative work-related topics to focus on and take any attention off of you. But for those of you who have made the decision to disclose in the workplace, there's always the chance that your diagnosis is brought up by someone in the office, really as a way to connect or touch base and check in with you. So this is another instance where it really pays off to be prepared for facing these situations head on. Using the SWIVEL that I just mentioned in the last slide is a really effective way to address these cancer-related comments. Ultimately, it's a verbal formula or pattern that's used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by a well-intended colleague. So it really involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation around to a topic more work-oriented. Now, for the sake of time today, I won't read the examples up on this slide, but you can certainly use them as references later on. But ultimately, being able to shift this conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be really empowering and indicate to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with a ton of professional contributions to make. Now, before we end our conversation for today, I do want to spend just a bit of time talking about incorporating time off into your action plan. We talked earlier about the fact that deciding whether or not to work during treatment doesn't need to be an all or nothing proposition, and people may decide to take some time off from work for a variety of reasons. Sometimes doing so is a choice that's made to help preserve energy levels or create some life balance. And other times taking time off is a necessity, such as recovery after surgery, or if you need to spend some time inpatient to receive particular types of treatment. One thing it's important to consider when incorporating time off into your action plan is how long you anticipate being on leave for the length of time can really influence the approach that you decide to take. So disclosure is a consideration if you decided to take time off as well. Perhaps you'd only like your direct supervisor or HR to know about your diagnosis. Others might want their coworkers to be aware of what's going on with them for a variety of reasons. So think about what you want to share and with whom as you prepare to take some of that time off. The Family and Medical Leave Act is a federal law that provides job protection when taking time off from work, and I'm going to provide a little bit more information on the next slide. But really, you're just going to want to spend some time thinking about whether your specific leave plan, what it's going to look like before having a conversation with your supervisor. This is a moment where using that information that you collected when you were getting yourself organized can really help the conversation with your employer just go a little bit smoother. Now, a little bit about the Family and Medical Leave Act, or the FMLA, is a federal law, just like the ADA, that may provide protections when taking time off. So this slide really provides a high-level overview of the FMLA, as well as some reasons where you can, resources of where you can go for more information. Now, it's important to note this law does not automatically apply to everyone. The qualifications are listed on this slide. But if you are eligible, FMLA can provide up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, which can be used all at once or in increments as short as a few hours at a time. And it does provide health insurance protection while out on leave. So you can check your employee handbook or speak with your supervisor or HR representative to find whether FMLA is available to you and or if there are other leave policies available in your workplace that are similar, which there may be. Now, a few recommendations for planning a leave of absence. In terms of short-term leave, you want to identify a point person, someone that you trust, who is willing to be a centralized source of information about you, your health, your schedule. This person can really help save you from having to constantly update everyone on how you're feeling or how you're doing, and can also be your go-to person to find out what's happening at the office and to stay updated. In the same context, taking time off and those who are still planning on returning to their same job, it's important to understand your employer's rules about working or volunteering while you're out on leave. So example, someone who checks their work email or attends a work event while on leave, that might be okay in some places, but in others it might not. So just being sure that you understand what that all looks like. Then for long-term leave, it can be a good idea to stay connected. This can be through LinkedIn, trade associations, attending conferences. To help offset gaps on a resume, you can try to stay active by consulting or volunteering, maybe engaging in activities that can refresh some of those existing skills or aid in learning some new ones. This is just a really easy way to stay informed, and really taking a course from home can be done from home in your PJs while you are recovering. So it's kind of something that you can do to stay in the loop. So now, as I've mentioned throughout, and it's hopefully a very clear theme today, circumstances are likely to change. And it's an important part of decision-making process to consistently monitor that what you're doing and the plan you're putting forth is working for you. Treatment, side effects, protocols, surgeries, et cetera, are all areas that could shift in a matter of days or weeks or months. So with this in mind, you want to be prepared to address these changes. Some ways to monitor your plan can include looking at what is still working, as that's a way to see what the backbone of your plan might be. And once those have been identified, look for anything that isn't working or isn't working as well as you need it to. Identify what new aspects of your situation are impacting your ability to have a concrete plan that works for your needs. And once you've figured out the answers to these questions, you'll be in a better position to implement the necessary changes and shifts. Now, upon monitoring and evaluating, you may find that an adjustment is necessary. This may be adapting prior choices to make them fit your circumstances better, or making completely new decisions. The key to adjusting your plan is to go ahead and revisit the steps that we discussed as part of the active decision making. So this means you're not reinventing the wheel and needing to repeat everything, but rather making sure that you're still ticking off all of those required boxes. Look through the information that was previously gathered and meticulously organized to help identify what is and is not helpful given what you know now. And if necessary, you want to gather new information to apply as needed. Having to adjust a plan doesn't mean you made any mistakes, but rather the entire experience, including that of the decision-making, is fluid and should be treated as such. Preparing to be agile and working to be flexible is an integral part of the decision-making process. So just to quickly recap, I know we're running a little short on time, and I will stick around for the Q&A for those of you who do have more questions that want to be answered. But I just want to quickly recap that you should feel empowered to make decisions about work after cancer that align with what you want and need. What information you'll need and where to find it will help you to make informed decisions. Getting organized can not only help you to make decisions about work after your cancer diagnosis, but can help to maintain control over your life. This is also extremely helpful if you need to adjust your approach later on. Action planning is focused on what your needs are and how realistically they can be addressed. Planning will help to make the process around your decisions much smoother. Disclosure is an important piece of the puzzle when making decisions around work, and really should be given the consideration necessary for you to feel comfortable in your situation. And finally, I know you're all sick of me saying this word, but everything is fluid. Decisions you make may be short or long-term and require revisitation and adjustment. Also, be sure to practice self-care throughout this whole process. Living in a sea of unknowns can feel stressful and exhausting, but taking care of yourself mentally and physically to the extent that you are able can make the entire process feel much more in your control. So I just want to point out some of those additional resources that I had mentioned. These are a bunch of legal ones that can be really helpful. And point out that we have some upcoming events, a bunch more great webinars scheduled for this year, some new ones that we are introducing that we're excited about. We have 2 virtual conferences coming up, one in March and one in June. And finally, here is my contact information in case we don't get to your question tonight or anything else comes up for you. So I'm going to bring Scott back on and we can address any of the questions that came in throughout. And I appreciate you all sticking around with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And just one more thing too, I've been trying to answer some questions and some links to our resources on our website, but if we don't get to your question today, please feel free to shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we'll be happy to talk one-on-one with you. Now, the first question I have here is, do you have any advice on how to avoid pressuring yourself and stressing yourself at work more than you need to? I find myself straining to be, quote, productive and burning out a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the name of the game is setting boundaries, which is really challenging professionally and on a personal level. We, I believe, have a webinar coming up later this year on setting boundaries. But really, it's about really evaluating what needs to be done and not just things that you think need to be done. So it's about being honest with yourself. It's about asking for help where you need to, and really prioritizing your health and mental health first. It's a process. It's really hard to do, but there are certain practices that you can do that can help you do that, because you're not going to be helping anyone or be productive if you are burnt out. So really checking in with your supervisor, if you have a good relationship with them, and really evaluating what is going to be most important is a good place to start. What's going to make you successful in the workplace is also a really good place to start.
Thank you. I just saw something in the chat asking if the PowerPoint we've shared, you should have gotten an email this afternoon. If you didn't, please shoot us an email and we can get it to you tomorrow. The last question I have for you tonight, Nicole, is I've been at my job for 4 years and have no idea where my employee handbook is or even have a copy of it anymore. How can I find the information without telling HR about my cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're, as an employee, entitled to that information. You were given it to it in the past. You could say you're looking into what your benefits are. You could make up any reason why you need that information. You don't have to tell them it's because you have a cancer diagnosis and you want to know if you can take time off. You can just say, I'm really interested in taking a look and seeing if there's any updates or anything to the employee handbook. Can I have a copy? And there shouldn't be any reason why they wouldn't give it to you.
Yeah, I think you can also ask a coworker if you don't feel comfortable going to HR.
Yeah, absolutely.
They might know. There's always that one person who knows where everything is. So if you find them. Well, thank you, Nicole. This was really great. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, if we didn't get to your questions or if you have anything else that you think of later on, please shoot us an email, cancerandcareers@cew.org, and we'd be happy to help you out there. So again, thank you, Nicole, and we hope to see you for the next one on March 1st.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.